Right, Year 13. This is just a talk through your Lit B3 exam, just to remind you of some of the basics that you need and to keep you focused and confident when you go into the exam room. The first thing, of course, are the AOs, and Lit B3 is far less complicated than Lit B1 in terms of exams because all the AOs are dealt with in Section A and all the AOs are dealt with in Section B. You don't have to think about split AO2 and then managing the rest of them for a second part of a question, so it's pretty straightforward. AO1, how well you write. AO2, analysis of form, structure and language, and I've got a very important point to make about analysis in a few slides' time. AO3, your connections, and AO4, your context. This is a useful way of looking at the different bands and how you can move yourself from, let's start at band 3, showing some understanding, going to band 4, where you explained things in good enough detail, band 5, where you're starting to analyse, say the effects of language, and up to band 6, where you evaluate. You show real confidence about the text and the genre, and you can make judgments. Now, this is straight from the chief examiner. The biggest concern they have in this paper is that some students do not answer the question under exam conditions or only answer part of questions. So this is the big message from the board: answer the questions. Nothing should come as a surprise. You should have anticipated all sorts of variations on the genre, and just as long as you focus on the question, you should be serving up what they want to see. And I'll show you some of the mistakes that are made. You have to unpick all the words in the question. You'll have heard your teacher use that phrase, and certainly at the exam board they use that phrase. So if we look at the January 2012, Section B, question 21 on the Gothic, it says Gothic writing lacks tension and suspense because the end is always inevitable. To what extent do you agree that Gothic writing does lack tension and suspense, and it's worth 40 marks? Now, I've highlighted two parts of that question because it shows very clearly how students can make a mistake under exam conditions. There were many students in the January paper who did focus on the tension and the suspense, but others totally ignored the end is always inevitable. And so huge marks were lost. They didn't answer the question in all its entirety. So you must unpick and answer all parts of the question. I just want to refocus on the way certain questions are actually worded and how some students can make some glaring mistakes with the wording of a question. So you're asked to answer the question, but take care with all the words. Now, for example, in January 2012, Section A, question 9, on the Bloody Chamber, the question was, Carter explores base instincts rather than subconscious desires. Consider at least 2 stories from the Bloody Chamber in the light of this comment. Now, a lot of students misinterpreted the word base instincts and used the word basic instincts instead, which is perhaps a more commonly well-known phrase talking about nurturing or love or what it is to be human, whereas base instincts is something much more subversive and perhaps unnatural. And in knowing the difference between those two words, you can see that some students answered the question and some students didn't at all. Actually talked about incorrect texts, incorrect characters in terms of, say, the mother in the Bloody Chamber showing the natural nurturing instinct, her basic instincts as a mother help save the daughter, whereby really the student should have talked about the base instincts of the male character in that story. Okay, when you're considering which text to write about in Section A or in Section B, you've got to consider, certainly, as so many of our students do here, study The Bloody Chamber and all the short stories in it, what actually constitutes a text and how many of those short stories should you include in your answer. Well, Section A is simple. It will tell you, say in The Bloody Chamber, you have to write about 2 of the short stories. So you're directed to how many texts that you need to write about. But in Section B, what does constitute a text? Well, actually, all the short stories are one text, but you can actually just write about one. Now, the problem is you've got to choose the one that is most apt for the question in Section B. So to have a broader knowledge of those short stories is essential so that you've got the flexibility to talk about the text, the most appropriate text, but you might actually feel more comfortable writing about a couple anyway, because it gives you more to write about. You can write a more detailed response. Now, one of the key things to remember is that the whole exam, you're really studying elements of the Gothic in our case. Some students will do the pastoral, but we do the Gothic. And so what does that mean for you in terms of writing in an exam? Well, as you know, the texts that you're studying aren't necessarily defined as a Gothic text. What you're really looking at are those elements or those aspects of the Gothic within that text. So you really have to have a broad overview of all the features of the Gothic genre and then be able to pick or recognise the elements of the genre in your chosen texts. So this means in Section A, there will be a text with a specific question on the Gothic element that's relevant to that text. So you're really writing about the text in relation to that whole Gothic element that is the heart of the question. Now in Section B, there's a general question addressing the Gothic element, potentially within 3 texts. So you really are talking about the Gothic there, and the way each text reveals those Gothic elements. Now, what implications does that have for Section A and Section B? Now, for Section A, you do not have to hammer home the Gothic all the time. And in fact, some very strong essays that I've seen for Section A, the word Gothic might only be used on a couple of occasions, because actually the whole Gothic element is implicit in the question, and the question will focus on the Gothic elements. Now, Section B is slightly different. You have to make connections to the Gothic here. But what's good is that you don't have to make comparisons, so you don't have to get yourself into a tangle trying to compare one text to another, all in the same paragraph, and then draw in the third text and try and untangle and make comparisons between the Gothic elements. You can handle it in a much more organised way. There'll be a general topic on the genres that the 3 texts must relate to. The best approach is to write an introduction and then 3 mini essays again. One thing to consider, though, is that the 3 texts must be written about substantially. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean equally, and here we have language again that if you've got a good vocabulary, you'll understand the differences between them. To write substantially, you've got to write in depth, you've got to analyse well. It doesn't necessarily mean you're writing pages and pages, okay? But you will lose marks if you write well and substantially about 2 texts, but then only a little bit that's got very little to say on the third. Now the third, certainly if you've got an issue with time, it doesn't have to be as long as the other 2, but it has to be deep and analytical, okay? And I would suggest that you write about the texts in the order of how well you know them, just to support your approach. But remember that that third text must be written about in a substantial way as well. Now, some Gothic elements that you might find useful. These are linked to the partner's tale, but of course some of these might be relevant to your own text, and I suggest that you look at the following 2 slides with me and the sort of elements that can be spotted in these 2 texts, and then do a similar exercise for your 3 texts. So for example, in the partner's tale, the elements of the Gothic are death, violence, sinfulness, excess, the macabre, melodrama, the unknown, and shock. Are any of those words useful? Any of those elements useful for your 3 texts? The same as Paradise Lost, possible Gothic elements: transgression, opposite extremes, overreaching, imprisonment and entrapment, darkness, the supernatural, awe and terror, aberration and conflict. Very interesting words. Elements of the Gothic. Are any of those useful for your particular texts? So I do suggest that you go through that exercise yourself as a revision exercise. Get cards or posters and list the elements of the Gothic for each of your 3 texts, so it's there ready to use and think about. So trying to consider the sort of questions that might be asked. One of the things to remember, of course, is that all 4 assessment objectives are addressed in both sections of the Lit B3 paper, and because they're all dealt with in the same way, it means that the sort of questions have got to be asked in similar ways as well. So the question format will remain sort of flexible, but there will only be a number of stems that can be used. So question stems will often point candidates towards the area of debate, the AO3, to encourage consideration of different interpretations. So the sort of question stems will be recognisable. So for example, these are some of the ones that have been used on past papers: discuss the view, explore the ways in which, consider the view that, to what extent, how far do you agree that. And these will actually offer you an opportunity to perform well, to stretch and challenge you, to actually force you to debate, get that AO3 in, but also AO1, having to structure your debate and handle the different readings and then conclude your ideas at the end. Now, because all 4 AOs are assessed in both Section A and Section B, let's really try and understand what that means in terms of writing in an exam. So AO1, let's think of it as the quality of writing. There is an expectation that your answers must be structured, must have clarity, be absolutely clear, be accurate, and the argument must be well shaped. So you must be focused on the question, okay, and avoid traps such as, if a named character is the subject of the debate, do not discuss another character as a counter-argument against, say, the failings or the heroic qualities of the named character. You really need to be talking about the named character and perhaps how well they succeed in terms of being heroic or not. You may want to just discuss another character briefly, but not then move right away from the named character and then just talk about another character being much more heroic or not than the named character. So be very careful about that. That's not actually a different interpretation, that's losing focus. Now, the Section B, how do you handle the 3 texts and how do you answer in a structured way? Well, you've got to have an introduction, and it focuses on the how you're going to answer that question. So you'll have the key words from that question and you'll consider some of the areas that you're going to explore. But then the 3 texts can all be discussed separately before the conclusion rounds off the debate. And remember that the 3 texts should all be handled substantially. And as I've said before, comparisons are not needed. It's the connections, and the connections have already been raised because you're discussing the text in relation to the question. and that's already been addressed in your introduction, and so you can discuss the three texts separately, and they're already connected. Now, AO2, form, structure, language. You've got to use those, the form, structure and language, in support of the argument. And of course, that is not just listing features, like how many similes or how many metaphors you can find in an extract. For the higher bands, you're asked to analyse and evaluate. And using quotes, just using quotes, is not analysis. And this is where a lot of students are losing marks. Even if you make a point and then you support it, that's not analysis. It's just using a quote to support an argument, which in fact is AO1. AO2 is only achieved if there is an analysis of, say, the language, if you're focusing on the language part. Now, something else to consider, the voice or the perspective in the text is AO2 because it's part of structure and form, and some people write quite naturally about voice and perspective because, of course, that links to AS and the aspects of narrative. And again, to re-emphasise the AO3, connections and comparisons, as I've said before, there's no need for direct comparisons. That's already been done in your coursework. So the connections for your Lit B3 paper are made through the concept of the genre and the question and how it directs you. You are not penalised by not making comparisons, so don't do it thinking that it's a higher level skill and that you will impress. In fact, if you do that in section B, you can often make life very difficult for yourself because some of those texts don't actually compare, and it can impede and undermine the quality of your response by forcing a comparison where one doesn't really exist. But of course, connections will exist in terms of the question. And something else to consider, who are these other readers? And I know some of you are very keen on your critics and you've learnt some critical quotation, but you don't actually have to do that. You can simply say some readers think. You might want to say a feminist interpretation might be this, a modern day reader, other readers might. Some students actually say some critics think, but it doesn't really impress. It just, it does signal or signpost that you are considering other readings. And certainly don't recall class discussions, which has been seen on Lit B3 papers, where a student uses the informal voice, first person, or talking and recalling classroom discussions. For example, when we discuss this in class, one student said this and another student said that. It just lacks any credibility. It does not have the subtlety of an English student. And AO4, context. Now, you're given lots of warnings about context, certainly at AS and at A2, that they mustn't be bolt on. But of course, there are many sorts of context: historical, social, political, critical, generic, and literary. Never do the bolted on stuff, whether it's historical or political background, and don't give a little potted literary history either, showing that that the first Gothic text was the Castle of Otranto. So extraneous context has no value. The context should naturally arise from the text and the question. Thank you. And the final message, answer the question. It's simple, but students avoid it, and that's going all the way back to my first points that you must refer to all words in the question and unpick the meanings so that you really are focused on answering the question. Best of luck, everyone.